Margaret Holloway had always been a quiet woman. At 72, her days were filled with routine walks through the small town of Ashwood, tending her garden, and sipping chamomile tea by the window of her modest house. To outsiders, she seemed harmless, even fragile. But beneath her silver hair and gentle smile was a storm waiting to break. 20 years ago, her life had been shattered. Her late husband, Richard, had mysteriously disappeared, and her closest friends had turned their backs on her. Worse, a powerful local businessman, Thomas Keller, had seized her family's land through lies and manipulation. The town believed it was just business, but Margaret knew it was betrayal. Now, in the winter of her life, she had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. She wasn't going to spend her final years in silence. Thomas Keller had underestimated her. And that mistake would be his undoing. Margaret began by quietly observing. She noted Keller's routines, his staff, his weaknesses. She listened in the shadows, learned the secrets that everyone thought were safe. Every whispered conversation, every careless mistake, every sign of vulnerability was a piece of her plan. But revenge, Margaret knew, wasn't about brute force, it was about precision. She wasn't just going to take back what was hers, she was going to make sure Keller understood the cost of underestimating a woman scorned. That evening, as snow dusted the streets of Ashwood, Margaret sat by her fireplace and opened an old, leather-bound journal. Inside were notes she had kept since Keller's betrayal, names, dates, promises broken, debts owed. Her hands trembled not from age, but from anticipation. "Time to finish what you started, Richard," she whispered, tracing the faded ink of her late husband's handwriting on the first page. "Time to set things right. If you like, I can continue the story in detailed chapters, gradually building tension, plot twists, and the execution of her revenge, making sure the full story eventually reaches 20,000 words. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 2 right now? Perfect. Let's continue with Chapter 2 and build the tension further. I'll keep it detailed and rich so it contributes meaningfully to the long story." The morning after her decision, Margaret walked through Ashwood with a purpose she hadn't felt in decades. The streets were quiet, with only the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Everyone knew Margaret Holloway as the gentle widow who kept to herself. No one suspected the cunning mind plotting behind those calm grey eyes. Her first step was subtle. She started by visiting the local library, digging into public records and town archives. Keller's empire wasn't just built on wealth, it was built on secrets. Margaret found old property deeds, legal loopholes, and financial documents that had long been buried in dusty filing cabinets. Her fingers trembled with excitement as she copied notes onto her pad. Later that day, she visited a small cafe where Keller often lunched. She watched him from a corner booth, taking mental notes. The man was arrogant, laughing loudly with his entourage, oblivious to the woman watching him like a hawk. She noted the way his security glanced nervously at the door every time someone entered. She remembered everything she had learned about him over the years, the reckless decisions, the overconfidence, the people he thought he could manipulate. That evening, Margaret returned home and retrieved an old chest from the attic. Inside were photographs of her younger self with Richard, letters they had exchanged during his business trips, and old financial records proving the Holloways had rightful claim to much of what Keller had stolen. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. Margaret's plan required patience. She needed to create opportunities, lure Keller into situations where his arrogance would be his downfall, and ensure every move was untraceable. She reached out discreetly to former allies, people Keller had wronged, people desperate for their own revenge. Through coded letters and secret meetings, she began to build a network. By the end of the week, she had 3 allies: Simon, a former employee of Keller-S who had been fired unfairly. Bitter and cunning, he had a personal vendetta. Elena, a young lawyer who had once tried to defend the Holloway estate but had been silenced by Keller-S influence. Marcus, a tech specialist who knew how to expose secrets that were supposed to remain hidden. Each had their own reasons for joining Margaret. And together, under her careful direction, they began to plot Keller-S undoing. That night, as Margaret sat by the fire and sipped her tea, she felt a thrill she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, and the memory of Richard. She whispered again to the empty room, "Thomas Keller want to know what hit him." We now have the setup and her first move, along with allies introduced. The story can naturally expand with intricate schemes, psychological battles, and escalating tension, eventually building to the final confrontation. I can continue directly with Chapter 3, Laying the Trap, where Margaret begins her first calculated strike. Great! Let's dive into Chapter 3, where Margaret begins to execute her first calculated strike against Keller. Margaret knew that brute force wouldn't work. Keller thrived on power and intimidation, and anyone who tried to confront him directly had either been silenced or ruined. The key was subtlety, turning his own arrogance against him. Her plan began with information. Over the next few days, she coordinated with Marcus, her tech specialist. Marcus had uncovered a series of questionable financial transactions linked to Keller-S company, Keller Industries. Offshore accounts, hidden assets, and evidence of bribery. The kind of evidence that could ruin him if it fell into the right hands. Meanwhile, Simon and Elena worked to plant seeds of doubt among Keller-S associates. Simon, with his insider knowledge, whispered half-truths to former employees, reminding them of Keller-S betrayals. Elena, using her legal expertise, subtly hinted at possible investigations into his dealings. Margaret watched all of it unfold like a chess master moving her pieces. The first direct move was delicate. Margaret arranged for a gala to be held in Ashwood, a charity event Keller would be compelled to attend, knowing the town would watch. Invitations were sent out, press would cover it, and the perfect stage for her first strike was set. On the night of the gala, Margaret arrived in a modest but elegant gown, blending in with the crowd while keeping a keen eye on Keller. He arrived in a tailored suit, surrounded by sycophants, exuding the confidence of a man untouchable. Margaret's allies were strategically positioned. Marcus had discreetly set up equipment to capture evidence of any illegal dealings that might surface during the gala. Simon mingled, ensuring that key former employees were in attendance. Elena, ever composed, monitored the legal implications, ready to act if Keller made a misstep. As the evening progressed, Keller's arrogance began to show. He laughed too loudly, made veiled threats to competitors, and casually dismissed anyone who disagreed with him. Margaret noticed the way his attention shifted when Simon approached him with a friendly smile and a vague story about past injustices. Keller didn't suspect a thing, but cracks were beginning to appear. Then came the first spark. A reporter, tipped off anonymously, asked Keller a pointed question about a recent business deal, a deal that had been shady at best. Keller tried to brush it off, but Marcus's discreet recordings ensured the truth was documented. Keller's face flushed with anger, but he didn't realize that Margaret had orchestrated the moment. By the end of the night, Margaret's plan had worked perfectly. Keller left the gala confident he had managed the situation, unaware that the seeds of doubt and evidence had already been planted. Margaret, back in her home, allowed herself a small smile. This was only the beginning. She wrote in her journal that night, "One move down. Many more to go." Let him think he's untouchable, his arrogance will be his downfall. With Chapter 3 complete, the story is now building momentum. Margaret's plans are unfolding, her allies are active, and Keller remains dangerously unaware. I can continue next with Chapter 4, Unraveling the Empire, where Margaret intensifies her moves, targeting Keller's business and personal life. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 4 now? Perfect. Let us continue with Chapter 4, where Margaret starts to unravel Keller's empire piece by piece. The weeks following the gala were crucial. Margaret had planted the seeds, and now it was time to let them grow. Keller's arrogance made him predictable, and Margaret exploited every predictable move with precision. Her first target was his business. Marcus had uncovered discrepancies in Keller Industries' financial reports, offshore accounts, missing funds, and falsified contracts. Margaret instructed Marcus to leak a portion of this evidence anonymously to the local financial regulator. She made sure it looked like an internal whistleblower had come forward. Within days, auditors began poking around. Keller initially laughed at the inquiries, confident that his influence would suppress any investigation. But Margaret had anticipated every angle. She had fed small hints to reporters, lawyers, and former employees. Rumors began to circulate. Keller's empire, so carefully built, was suddenly under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Margaret's personal tactics were even more devastating. Simon began quietly reminding Keller's trusted associates of past betrayals, showing them evidence of how Keller had used and discarded them. Loyalty crumbled. Key executives began to question Keller's leadership, some even resigning quietly, while others nervously awaited the next move. Margaret herself played a ghostly role in Keller's personal life. Anonymous letters arrived at his mansion, hinting at secrets from his past and suggesting that someone was watching. A trusted aide discovered emails revealing Keller's shady dealings. A few personal messages exposed hidden relationships. It was psychological warfare, subtle, precise, and unnerving. One night, Margaret sat in her dimly lit kitchen, sipping tea, listening to the distant hum of the town settling under snow. She smiled at a new development. Keller had begun to isolate himself, trusting no one. He was growing paranoid. This was exactly the reaction she had predicted. Elena sent her a message. A major deal Keller had been negotiating for months was falling apart because potential partners refused to get involved amidst the rumors of financial misconduct. Margaret's heart quickened. Each step brought Keller closer to the edge, and each edge he approached made him more vulnerable. But Margaret didn't rush. Patience had always been her greatest weapon. She knew that one wrong move could alert Keller to her presence. Her goal was total dismantling, not just minor setbacks. She wanted him humiliated, exposed, and powerless, the same way he had left her decades ago. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "Every empire has its cracks. Thomas Keller's are many. And I will widen each one until it collapses entirely." At this point, the story is ramping up tension, showing how Margaret uses intellect, patience, and psychological strategy to systematically dismantle Keller's life. Next, we can move to Chapter 5, The Perfect Storm, where Keller starts to realize he's being targeted and begins to fight back, raising the stakes and pushing Margaret to her limits. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 5 now? Perfect. Here's Chapter 5, The Perfect Storm, where Keller starts realizing he's under attack and the tension escalates. The snow had melted into a grey, cold drizzle as Keller paced his office late one night. The arrogance that had carried him through decades of deceit was cracking. Deals that once seemed guaranteed were collapsing. Partners withdrew. Employees whispered behind his back. Even his personal life felt like it was unraveling. Keller didn't yet know who was orchestrating his downfall, but he could feel the invisible hand pressing against him. For the first time in his life, he was uncertain. Fear settled in a slow, heavy weight. Margaret, meanwhile, observed from a distance. She had no intention of revealing herself just yet. She let Keller stew in his paranoia, carefully monitoring every response to her moves. Each setback she engineered, each whisper she planted, each anonymous tip she sent, worked in tandem to erode his confidence. The storm escalated when a former business partner confronted Keller publicly at a town council meeting, citing unethical practices that echoed rumors Margaret had begun circulating weeks prior. Keller, usually confident and controlling, faltered. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. The story went viral online within hours. Back at her house, Margaret sipped tea calmly, watching the news. Keller's empire wasn't just cracking, it was splintering. Her plan was entering a phase she had long anticipated, forcing him into reactive mistakes. Keller, desperate to reclaim control, began making risky decisions. He demanded loyalty pledges from staff, pressured suppliers, and tried to buy off critics. But Margaret had anticipated every move. Simon intercepted key communications, Elena ensured every legal threat Keller made backfired, and Marcus monitored digital traces to stay several steps ahead. Even Keller's personal relationships were unraveling. Former friends distanced themselves. His children, once under his influence, began questioning his decisions after subtle revelations planted by Margaret. His nights were restless, his days, frantic. Margaret's psychological strategy had become a perfect storm, and Keller was trapped in it. But Margaret was not done. The storm she had created was only the precursor to the final act. Keller's vulnerabilities were exposed, his defenses weakened, and the town itself had begun to murmur doubts about the untouchable tycoon. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she wrote in her journal, "Let him break under the weight of his own arrogance. Soon, the final move will come. Soon, justice will be served." At this point, Keller is beginning to sense the threat, paranoia is creeping in, and Margaret's plan is reaching its climax. The story can now build toward the final confrontation, ultimate revenge and resolution. Next, we can continue with Chapter 6, The Final Move, where Margaret prepares her ultimate strike to ensure Keller cannot recover. Should I continue with Chapter 6 now? Excellent. Let us continue. The story now moves toward the endgame, where Margaret prepares the decisive blow. Margaret Holloway had waited most of her life for this moment. The town of Ashwood buzzed with tension. Keller Industries was officially under federal investigation now. Auditors camped inside the glass tower that once symbolized Thomas Keller's invincibility. News vans lined the streets. Investors panicked. The empire was bleeding. And still Margaret waited. Revenge, she believed, was never about speed. It was about timing. She sat at her kitchen table late one night, the old journal open in front of her. Richard's handwriting stared back at her from the yellowed pages: calculations, land surveys, legal notes. Proof that everything Keller had built was rooted in theft. "This ends tomorrow," she whispered. The setup. Elena finalized the legal strategy. Marcus compiled the final digital evidence: emails, wire transfers, recordings. Simon confirmed Keller would attend the emergency shareholders meeting the next morning, desperate to reassure those still loyal to him. Margaret's presence there would be unexpected. That was the point. For years, Keller had erased her, called her a confused widow, dismissed her claims, destroyed her reputation. Tomorrow, she would stand in the same room where he once laughed her out of existence. And she would speak. The confrontation. The conference hall was packed. Executives whispered. Lawyers shuffled papers. Keller stood at the podium, his voice firm but hollow. The confidence was gone. His eyes darted constantly, hunting ghosts. Then the doors opened. Margaret walked in slowly, her back straight, her expression calm. A murmur rippled through the room. Keller froze. Mrs. Holloway, someone whispered. Margaret stopped at the front row. She met Keller's eyes. For a split second, something flickered across his face: recognition, disbelief, and finally fear. Mr. Keller, she said clearly. I believe this meeting concerns stolen property. The room erupted. Before Keller could respond, Elena stepped forward, filing documents with the board. Marcus activated the screen behind the podium. Evidence flooded the display: contracts, land deeds, financial records, recorded conversations. Keller shouted, denied, threatened. But it was too late. Every lie collapsed under the weight of truth. Margaret spoke last. You took my husband's life work. You destroyed my name. You thought age made me weak. She paused. You were wrong. Security escorted Keller out as shareholders watched in stunned silence. Aftermath. Within weeks, Keller Industries collapsed. Assets were seized. Charges were filed. Keller's allies vanished. The town of Ashwood reclaimed the land that had been stolen decades earlier, returned legally, publicly, permanently to Margaret Holloway. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile for cameras. She went home. Epilogue, the last ember. Spring arrived quietly. Margaret planted a new garden on the reclaimed land. She placed a small plaque beneath an oak tree, Richard Holloway. Truth outlives power. She lived simply. Peacefully. Revenge had not consumed her, it had freed her. And in Ashwood, people would remember the story for generations. Never underestimate a woman who has waited patiently. Never mistake silence for weakness. And never assume time erases truth. Because sometimes justice only grows stronger with age.